Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. So Congressman, I think that we should start kind of picking it up from the end of last year when this task force that you lead came out with a report. Can you walk us through what that report says?
Sure. So it was an honor for me to lead a deeply talented group of people last year in creating this report. Our chartered task was to, by the end of last year, create a report that details a proposed federal regulatory framework for AI and suggests some steps forward. So we had 24 members of our task force, 12 Republicans, 12 Democrats, and we had 25 different hearings last year, so we were very active, tried to engage all the different corners of the stakeholder universe. And we put out a report in December that I'm very proud of. It's, I think, the most detailed policy document on AI regulation that's been produced by any legislative body anywhere in the world. It's 270 pages long, 14 different chapters, and we come up with over 60 key findings and over 80 detailed policy recommendations. And so we organized that report to be a checklist for future Congresses, starting hopefully with this one. And so we think if future Congresses implement those 80 recommendations, that'll be a great start in implementing the policy framework that we're proposing.
If we could zoom in on one of the specific areas of the report, you get into the open versus closed source debate, and the report says that Congress should not seek to impose undue burdens on developers in the absence of clear, demonstrable risk. That sounds to me like lawmakers who kind of created this report landed on the side of being in favor of open source models. Can you walk me through that finding and what it means?
You know, I wouldn't really agree with that. I think what we found is that there are advantages to both open source and closed source. And as you say, a whole chapter of the report is on this debate. And there's arguments on both sides. People that are proponents of open source are talking about the transparency and the way that innovation can flourish when you have an open source model. Proponents of closed source are arguing that open source is inherently riskier because it's easier to remove any safeguards that you baked into the model when you trained it. And basically, there are grains of truth on both sides. But what we found is, overall, the report is embracing a light touch regulatory framework where we enact the safeguards that are necessary to protect people against the malicious use of AI and the harmful use of the technology, while still creating an environment that allows innovation to flourish and the deployment of AI to continue to bring these incredible productivity and creativity gains that it's possible to bring to American society and American companies. So what we say in the chapter is we don't think that there's enough risk here for us as regulators to put our thumb on the scale and say open source models are better or closed source models are better. We think that there is enough variety in the ecosystem for both of those models to flourish.
What would a demonstrable risk look like?
Oh, I mean, if you look at what lawyers call the parade of horribles, right? All the worst things that can happen with AI. You come up with things like, can a large language model be used to design and build a biological weapon, for example? Or can it be used in cyber theft or cyber fraud? Or can it be used to hack in a way that endangers our national security? So, I mean, those are really the highest level existential risks that you want to guard against. And those are the ones that people cite most frequently when they're talking about protections that are baked into a model being removed.
And you mentioned, this is a very long report. It's the most extensive yet. What are some of the broad set of principles that you lay out there that Congress should follow?
Well, we embrace something that we call sectoral regulation, which is very different than is being proposed in other parts of the world. So, for example, the European Union has proposed a different model where they are creating a nearly universal licensing requirement for anything but the lowest risk use cases for AI, and they're spinning up a brand new bureaucracy to create standards and tests for the issuance of those licenses. And we think that that is not something that's well suited to our American system of regulation. Instead, we suggest empowering our existing sectoral regulators to regulate within their spaces. And the reason why that makes sense is that there's been some deep thinking done on what we mean when we say risk in AI models. So last year, NIST put out a proposed risk management framework for AI, and that's been acknowledged as pretty much the furthest thinking document on AI risk that's been done in the world. And what they find predominantly is that the risks of AI are highly contextual. So in other words, it matters very much what you're going to do with an algorithm. And only when you've defined that can you then define what the risks you're trying to guard against are. So something that is unacceptably risky in one usage context, like, for example, in a medical diagnostic tool, might be completely benign in another risk context. Exactly the same algorithm, two different risks, two different risk frameworks, and two different determinations of what's acceptable and what's not, and what rules must be followed. So if you're the FDA and you're regulating the use of AI in a medical device, then a lot of scrutiny is warranted. We would say that's a high-risk use case. And you know what? They're already having to navigate this. The FDA has already issued over 1,000 licenses for the use of AI in medical devices. And if you talk to the stakeholders, they're doing a pretty good job. And that's true of other sectoral regulators as well. The FAA is having to make decisions about the use of AI in aircraft avionics. NHTSA is having to make decisions about the use of AI in autonomous driving systems. And the list goes on and on and on. So the question that we ask in the task force is, would it be easier to teach the FDA what it might not already know about AI, or would it be easier to teach a brand new agency that's just the regulator for AI methodologies, everything that the FDA has learned over the last 50 years about ensuring patient safety? And I think it's pretty clear that the answer is the former, not the latter. So that's sectoral regulation is one thing. And then incrementalism, I think, is something else that's very important, and we emphasize that in our report. This idea that we can pass one 3,000-page bill and be done with AI regulation, I think, is a fallacy. AI is such a fast-moving technology that no matter what we did, there would be parts of that framework that would be obsolete the day after we did it. So the EU has found this out, because as they've been drafting and passing their legislation, first large language models came into existence, and then more recently generative AI. And then I think the next iteration is going to be agentic AI, and that's we're starting to see that. That's going to completely change our approach to regulation and what's required. So to pretend we know enough to do all of that now, I think, is foolish. But we do not know enough to pick the low-hanging fruit. There are things that have greater urgency that need immediate action. There are things that we understand well enough that we can say, yes, we can do this now. But then there are other topics that we have a little bit more runway, and I think it's more appropriate that we be deliberate and thoughtful. And that's okay. I think that's okay to pass this in little pieces.
Yeah. So a sectoral approach, an incremental approach. So even though this report was so long, it really didn't name many specific bills. I think it was only one that was named. Can you speak to why it was difficult to get specific legislation in the report when there are a lot of ideas already out there, bipartisan ideas on many of these issues, whether it's privacy, algorithm accountability, et cetera?
Well, we thought it was very important not to get into the specifics of legislative language, because then you get down the rabbit hole of arguing about one word, right? And we wanted to make sure that we presented something that was a broad-based framework that everyone agreed with. And that's actually incredibly important to realize. We had 24 different task force members from 12, both sides of the aisle, all different political persuasions, lots of different policy committees represented, and all different walks of life. And that task force report was approved unanimously. And it was approved by the Speaker and his staff and the Minority Leader and his staff. That's a powerful thing. I mean, we didn't put anything in that report that we didn't have broad-based agreement on. And we came up with over 80 recommendations. So there was a lot more that we discussed that wasn't ripe for action. And we felt like if we talked about specific bills and specific language, then we would get all twisted around the axle on arguing about minutia when we tried to keep it at a high level. And that's why we didn't. But I think that we're ripe for action on a number of those different topics, and I hope to see us doing that this year.
For the Create AI Act, could you give us a sense of timing on when we might see that move?
Well, move. So I was deeply disappointed that we did not get that across the finish line last year. I think it would have been a fitting tribute to Anna Eshoo, who was deeply passionate about this issue. So I'm reintroducing that this year, and we are going to try and move it. I am cautiously optimistic that we're going to be successful.
So what are the next steps for the task force for implementing this report? Has the task force been formally authorized yet?
So we are in discussions about what the task force will look like this year. I am very much convinced that we still need a nucleus of people that are dedicated to action on this issue. And I feel like we completed the planning phase and came out with this report, and so now we have concrete steps that need to be taken, and I think we need a place to launch the legislation that's going to implement that. So I'm pushing for the formation of an AI select committee. We're getting some pushback from the existing policy committees feeling like we want to steal their jurisdiction away, which we're not trying to do. I understand that this is a common debate in DC. I don't care if we introduce legislation and it gets referred, dual referred or triple referred to different policy committees. I just think we need a nucleus to get it launched. But one way or the other, one of the points we made in the report is we had a whole chapter on the topic of preemption. And what we absolutely want to avoid is a patchwork of 50 different state regulations on AI. AI is very clearly an interstate commerce issue, and I think that predominantly regulation of AI needs to be done at the federal level. If you allow 50 different state regulations to exist, what you've created is an enormous barrier to entry to innovation. So if you're Google, not to pick on them, but they've got buildings full of lawyers, they can actually navigate a regulatory landscape that complex. The people who can't navigate it are two people in a garage trying to start the next Google. That's what happened to us on digital data privacy. We absolutely cannot allow that to happen on AI. So we need to get moving because, frankly, you're seeing these states act to fill the void that we've left at AI regulation at the federal level. And we need to give people the confidence that Congress is capable of acting on this issue. And the only way we do that is to start implementing some of these recommendations. We can't preempt something with nothing. So we need to give states that confidence. And I think if we do, then we're going to get to a place where we can define where the boundaries of preemption are going to go, and people will be accepting of it.
So moving on to a different issue that, again, is touched on in this report, high-skilled immigration. Could you speak to the importance of that to win this global tech race? And do you think that all of the focus being on undocumented migrants takes away from getting something on high-skilled immigration across the finish line on Capitol Hill?
Right. Well, I've been very vocal in my belief that we need more high-skilled immigration to help America stay at the forefront of AI development and deployment. We have abundant resources here. We've got more compute than anywhere in the world. Hopefully, we're going to get our arms around the energy problem. That's a whole different chapter of the report where we talk about some of the challenges there. But we've got our capital markets are the biggest and the best in the world. So we've got all of those preconditions are met. But what we also need is the top talent. And I don't want to create an environment where we're bringing someone from another country over here on a student visa, educating them in the best education system in the country, giving them a PhD in artificial intelligence, and then sending them back to their home country to compete with us. That makes no sense to me. So to answer your question, I actually am optimistic about this. I don't think that the focus on illegal immigration necessarily means that we're further restricting legal immigration. I actually think it makes the conversation easier to have, because every time in the past that we in Congress have started to have a comprehensive discussion about immigration reform, that's taken as a sign that we're not going to crack down on the illegal immigration question. So if we're willing to crack down on illegal immigration, I think that actually gives us more headroom to be able to be more permissive of legal immigration in ways that helps the country. And and I've also said I think any PhD that's awarded in a STEM field in the United States should come with a green card if you're not a citizen. That's how strongly I feel about it.
Can you describe any collaboration with the Senate at this point on any of these issues in AI regulation?
Sure. Well, we're very clear in the report that anything that we do that's going to be substantive and enduring is going to have to be both bipartisan and bicameral. That's just the reality of the world that we live in. And so rather than starting something as either partisan or House-based, it makes more sense to just admit from the start that we're going to all have to cooperate and push in the same direction to get these done. And so I think the Senate's done some really good work, and we had a lot of engagement with them as we went through the task force hearings. They had obviously a task force of their own. They kind of took a different focus, and they delivered earlier in the year, so I think that their report and our report complement each other very well. They didn't focus on the policy broad strokes. They kind of focused on the minutia in terms of like procurement and the impact that AI is going to have on the Department of Defense and national security, and I think that was very helpful. I think that goes along with our report that goes and makes the broader-based policy recommendations. So I would hope that whatever we're going to do in the future is going to be bicameral.
The AI Safety Institute is this agency housed within NIST that is responsible for setting standards for AI. It does not have a permanent leader yet, and its staff was not invited to a major summit happening in Paris right now over AI regulation. What is the future of this agency in your view? Do you see it being empowered to set standards?
Yeah, I think we need something like the Safety Institute. Talk about the Paris conference. I mean, we were very well represented there. Vice President Vance is over there right now. He gave one of the keynote speeches this morning in the conference. And so I don't think it was necessary to have broader administration representation there. But what we do need is, if you're going to talk about regulation being sectoral, we need to give our sectoral regulators a toolbox of lots of different tools that they can use to accomplish their job of regulating within their sectoral space. And that needs to be put together by an entity like the Safety Institute. They need to put together testing and evaluation methodologies. They need to put together different standards. They need to put together regulatory sandboxes for the testing of potentially malicious AI. They need to put together a tool of technical talent to help our sectoral regulators. But what I'm trying to evangelize to especially people on my side of the aisle is these are not necessarily compulsory or mandatory, right? These standards are just tools, and it'll be up to the sectoral regulators to figure out which of these testing and evaluation methodologies to use and which not, and that's okay, right? And we just want to make sure that when we ask, for example, the FDA to regulate AI in their sectoral space, we give them the tools to do it. And so it makes no sense to invent those tools over and over and over again. And that's why I think we need to codify something like the Safety Institute. So I'll be introducing legislation to do exactly that, and I look forward to having that discussion.
And you're in favor of those being voluntary, those standards? That's not something Congress should come in and make a law? Well,
I mean, to be clear, the Safety Institute is organized under NIST, right? NIST is not a regulatory agency. NIST is not in the business of creating standards that are mandatory and are intended to be applied to everyone. They're creating these tools. And I think that that's appropriate. And so this is the message I'm trying to reinforce to people, to make sure everyone understands what the job of the Safety Institute or Reliability Institute or whatever it ends up getting called is.
A lot of this work was already underway. It was instructed through the former administration's AI executive order. We know that President Trump came in and repealed that executive order. What did you make of that move? Did you think that it was necessary?
Well, I was very vocal about the parts of the EO that I disagreed with, and there were a few that I thought were egregious overreaches. For example, the way that it invoked the Defense Production Act to require American companies to disclose their trade secrets to the government. I didn't think that was appropriate, and I particularly didn't feel like that was an appropriate use of the DPA. Certainly that's not what Congress intended when it was passed after World War II. Also, I think that there were a lot of instances in the EO where regulatory powers were assumed to have been delegated to executive branch agencies by Congress, but in reality, no such delegation ever had occurred. And as we've seen with recent Supreme Court's decisions, like the one overturning the Chevron doctrine, the courts are cracking down on that. And so my message to the regulators was, help us help you. To the extent that you doubt or think you might not have authority, ask us for the authority, and we will make sure you get it with the appropriate guardrails and oversight that comes along with that authority. But don't assume that you have it, because then we're just going to wind up tied up in court. So those are the parts of the EO that I disagreed with, but there were a lot of parts that were good too. I think President Trump was right to repeal it. I think that the decision was repeal the whole thing and replace it, or just go through and try and repeal the parts that were the bad parts and keep the other parts. And so I think that the 180-day shot clock that they've called now on replacing it is very encouraging, because it means that they're thinking about it in the context of keeping the good and throwing out the bad.
What are you hoping they keep?
Well, there was a lot in that EO that dealt with the way that AI can be used to enhance the efficiency of government and enhance the efficacy by which we provide government services to people. Some deep thinking went into those parts of the executive order, and those are the parts I think that need to be kept.
You've previously said that Congress needs to provide tech and science agencies with the tools and the resources that they need. That doesn't necessarily mean more money, though. Can you describe the appropriations process on the Hill right now and the likelihood that these agencies will get more resources?
Oh, my goodness. I have to avoid four-letter words here if I'm going to describe the appropriations process currently. Why I was late this morning is we're working on reconciliation, and oh, my goodness, it's been a lot. And of course, we got government funding expiring at the middle of March that's going to have to be dealt with. So, those are all short-term problems, and the ones that you're talking about are longer-term problems. And, I actually think if you look at the way that the Trump administration is approaching the reorganization of the executive branch, they're trying to be very cognizant of what is necessary and required and what is not. And, I think that when you parse it down to what we're saying is necessary, we're going to have agreement on that.
So, to shift gears a little bit on a related note, DOGE is out there, going to these various agencies and instructing agencies like the National Science Foundation to downsize its staff, cut its budget. Grants have been suspended. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I'm a science, space, and technology guy. I now chair the subcommittee on research and technology. So I am a deep believer in the government's role in funding basic sciences. And I've been a strong proponent of increasing funding in places where it made sense. Having said all of that, if you look at some of the stuff that DOGE has found, it's horrifying, the money that has been spent. And so I think when the dust settles, I know there's a lot of fear and angst out there, but I think when the dust settles, you'll find that the stuff that's getting cut is the stuff that was pretty wasteful and difficult to justify to taxpayers why their money is going towards that in an era when we're running a $2 trillion budget deficit. So I think that there is a middle ground there where we can keep the NSF focused on its core mission of funding those basic sciences, while cutting off some of the waste and abuse that's happened on the periphery. And that's what I think the Trump administration is doing.
All right. Well, that is all the time we have, Congressman. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone.